Welcome to Gameology. My name is James Napoli. I am a paleontologist based at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. I study the evolution and development of dinosaurs, especially meat-eating dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor. Today we're going to be looking at the fossil quest line in Red Dead Redemption 2. Now let's get into it. Finding the bones is probably the most important part of doing paleontology, so I'm excited to see what they have here. They've put the setting of this fossil discovery in a pretty realistic sort of landscape. Generally speaking, we tend to go to arid environments for fossil hunting. It's easier to see rock outcrops if there's not vegetation in the way. Trees and grasses and vines and things make it hard to find fossils. They tend to break fossils apart. So arid environments like this are the best, and specifically badland environments with a lot of erosion, so steep kinds of cliffs like this, are really, really good for fossil finding because to find a bone, you need it to be exposed at the surface through weathering and erosion. And in areas where you've got a lot of exposed rock layers, you're more likely to find fossil materials. So badland settings like this in the American West are really the center of American vertebrate paleontology. And really global vertebrate paleontology. This is how we look for fossils all over the world. So I'm not even seeing the fossil that he's apparently finding here. Oh, here it is here. Okay, so that's what he's looking at. So this would be a rare fossil discovery. What Arthur's looking at here appears to be a leg. You can see that there's kind of a blade-like bone all the way on the left. That's probably the ilium, one of the three bones that make up the hip. There's a femur, which is the single long bone of the thigh. That's the largest bone in most animals' bodies. And then an articulated tibia and fibula. The tibia is the more robust bone in the shin. The fibula is a very small bone in the shin that mostly serves for muscle attachment. It doesn't really bear weight. So this is not completely unrealistic for how we might discover a fossil. It is eroding out of the landscape, which is exactly how we find fossils normally. It's relatively articulated, but it's not a complete fossil. So articulated in this context refers to just the idea that the bones are touching each other kind of in the same arrangement they were in life. Based on what I see here, I don't know exactly what kind of animal this would be. The ilium does, to some degree, represent something that looks a little bit like a dinosaur ilium, but it's hard to tell from this angle. You'd need the bones to be prepared better, and I would need to study them. So this could fit with being a dinosaur skeleton. One thing I've always loved about Red Dead, it's just how realistically it depicts this part of the country and this part of the world. Just gorgeous, and it's really, really, really wonderful, especially when you go out there and you kind of feel like you're in the game. Okay, so this is something that's pretty unrealistic here. A couple things wrong with this. And I understand why this is like this for gameplay purposes, because you need the players to actually be able to see this. Fossils don't really come out of the ground in areas like this. This is an area with a lot of sediment and vegetation. You're not going to see fossils poking out of this kind of landscape. They're going to be covered up by the loose sediment. So the prior location that we saw was a much better example of that, where it looked like it was really coming out of a hillside as it eroded. This is kind of on a flat surface, an area with not a lot of erosion. If this area were eroding down naturally and this fossil did happen to be there through something unlikely, these thin, delicate ribs would not still be standing up out of the ground. Fossils are actually very weak. We need to cover them in a lot of glue to safely get them out of the ground. It's just an unfortunate reality that bones that have been preserved that longer tend to be fairly fragile, and so when you remove them from the rock, they start to break down. And fossil preparators and collectors and technicians are really skilled at doing the sorts of things necessary to keep bones in good condition. They just simply wouldn't look like this. The ribs would have crumbled to dust if they were sticking that far out of the ground naturally. Not to mention the probability that, a horse or animal would have come by and tripped on them and ground them into powder. Generally speaking, this looks much more like it's supposed to represent the carcass of some recently dead animal, right? Something that died and decomposed there, and its bones are still sticking out of the ground. They've been covered a little bit by sediment movement since it died. This wouldn't really map for a fossil. So this is something that's a little bit more realistic. Not the pile of loose bones kind of in the middle of the screen, but the larger things sticking up out of the ground. Now, I've previously said that ribs are probably not going to still stick out of the ground like this in a real-life setting. That would just require a degree of strength that they don't have. That said, obviously, in the video game, again, the players need to be able to see the fossils, so it's a pretty reasonable departure from reality. Now, I previously was talking about the fact that fossils are probably not going to be found in relatively flat areas without a lot of erosion, which this might look like initially. But this is a riverbed, and rivers are like the prime erosional area in a lot of circumstances. As water moves it towards sediment, rivers are, in many of Earth's environments, the main erosional forces. Water tends to transport a lot of sediment and reveal a lot of fossil material underneath. Even when fossils are eroding out of hillsides, a lot of that erosion is going to be taking place because the area is being rained on and water is moving over the sediment. Riverbeds like this are not the kind of primary places we dig for a lot of logistical reasons. It's hard to dig in wet environments, you can't get your glue to dry. But I've actually done some field work in areas very much like this where you mostly find fossils eroding out of the riverbed. One thing I should note is that nothing comes to mind that has ribs similar to this with this kind of really rounded point at the end of the rib. Certainly no dinosaurs that I can think of. It's possible that this sort of anatomy exists somewhere, but I can't think of what it would represent offhand. This is something that makes a little bit more sense, right? So we've got a hillside being eroded backward by water and wind movement, and we have a set of fossils that's exposed. I'm not going to keep harping on the point that the rib cage would probably not be sticking out of the ground like that. I think you probably get it by now. Fossils are pretty delicate. They don't stick right out of the ground. One thing that I should probably note is that that's way too many ribs to be from most animals, especially animals of that size. Things that have that number of ribs are generally going to be like reptiles. Snakes come to mind. Snakes have hundreds of pairs of ribs. But most animals of this kind of body size, this number of ribs is excessive. Usually it's between 10 and 15 pairs of ribs. It's possible this is supposed to represent a snake rib cage. That's the only animal I can really think of where the ribs would be that numerous, but there's not a lot of snakes that got to that size. A lot of people get this image of fossil discovery that's kind of informed by movies like Jurassic Park, where it's a bunch of people out in the desert all brushing dust away from a perfectly preserved skeleton that looks exactly like the animal would have looked when it died. And that's absolutely not how any vertebrate paleontology really works. Fossil material is usually really difficult to spot unless you're trained. The bone tends to blend in with the rock fairly well. Often the bone that's exposed is really weathered and bad quality, so you kind of have to know that it's bone and start digging in that area hoping you find more. It's most common to find very disarticulated remains, so isolated bones from the finger or isolated ribs or vertebrae. It's rare to find a whole articulated animal. We know to look in these areas basically from the geological record. So we know where the right kind of rocks from the right age are preserved to preserve dinosaur fossils. And then you do a lot of prospecting, as we call it, where we literally do just walk around in areas where we know the right kinds of rock outcrops exist, hoping that we find something. And that's kind of how dinosaur discoveries are made yearly. There's a new species of dinosaur named on average once every week to 2 weeks. That's a really, really fast rate of discovery. And what's happening is that the rocks are continuing to erode over time, and more fossils are being exposed. So paleontologists spend their summers out looking for them. Sometimes you go prospecting and you don't find any material. Often, though, you'll prospect for a few days and you find a site that becomes fairly promising and you excavate it. The excavation can take a long time. And then you either move on to another site in another area, or you keep prospecting in the same area and find more localities that are yielding more fossil material. And it's not uncommon to be working several quarries at the same time with different parts of your team. Or oftentimes, miners who are looking for gold or other rare, valuable metals will be digging in an area and say, we didn't find any gold, but we found some dinosaur bones. Okay, so we're at the water's edge in a pond. I suspect the fossil's gonna wind up being near here somewhere. Sun showers like this are pretty common out west, something we deal with a lot in fossil hunting. Given the amount of glue and plaster we need to use in our work, it's rare for us to keep digging in rain. This kind of sun shower we might wait out, just to see if it'll pass or if it's going to get worse. Generally, if it starts being pretty severe with weather though, paleontologists wouldn't still be out working, just because it's a little bit dangerous for us, but it really impedes with a lot of the things we need to do to discover the fossils. So if it starts to rain pretty hard, we'll generally put a tarp over the site, weigh it down with some sediment, and just hope that the fossils make it through okay so that we can resume work the next day. Absolutely stunning environment. This game is just such a triumph of art direction, game design, everything. Okay, so here we find a really implausible location for a fossil. So the fossil's kind of at the top of a hill that's covered in vegetation, trees and grass and everything. Obviously covered in soil. This is not the sort of area generally that you'd expect fossils to be discovered. Again, you really want to go for very arid areas that are dominated by heavy erosion. So this kind of very gentle hill right at the top of it where there's not a lot of topography, the fossil really just looking like it's in relief against the sediment. This is not the kind of thing that really happens. I suspect this is supposed to be a mammal forelimb. The scapula, the shoulder blade, which is the bone all the way at the left here, if it's a mammal, should have a ridge running down the middle called the scapular spine. That's something that only mammals have. This doesn't have it, and it's generally a little bit reminiscent of a reptilian scapula. I want to direct your attention to the two bones that form the lower arm. So those are the radius and the ulna. This is my radius here, and my ulna goes up this way on my pinky side. Looking at this, there's a short digit that's clearly supposed to be the thumb, but the ulna, the longer and more robust bone in the forelimb, is on the same side as that. So the forelimb is built incorrectly. The one way we can know it's a mammal, though, is that the radius bone has this circular joint at the top of the bone. This is something that only mammals have, and it's what allows us to kind of do this with our arm. This requires that you have a rotary joint on your radius that you can use to spin it over your ulna. It's a really cool piece of attention to detail. I guess the takeaway from this fossil is that the game occasionally has really, really intricate attention to detail, and sometimes makes some pretty big mistakes with skeletal anatomy. Again, unfortunately for me, I'm pretty familiar with this game, so I can usually anticipate what's going to happen. This game came out the first year of my PhD, and you bet I was having a great time being a cowboy looking for dinosaur bones when I was off from being a young, tired grad student looking for dinosaur bones. Okay, so a couple things here. Generally, in terms of the way this is depicted, it seems pretty accurate for how we would find fossils when they're exposed in situ in the field. The fossil is almost flush against the surface of the rock. You don't have a huge projecting kind of spike or spire sticking out of the rock that would cause it to be broken down easily. This, to me, looks like a walrus skull. We're seeing it from the front and kind of the bottom, so those are two tusks coming down. The rest of the skull would still be in the rock. The one problem with this is that from the general surface form of the weathering of this, I think that this area of the game was much more closely modeled on igneous and metamorphic rock formations than sedimentary ones. So sedimentary rocks tend to be deposited in horizontal or angled beds that have pretty clearly defined margins. Igneous and metamorphic rocks don't preserve fossils. Only sedimentary rocks do. The way that the fossil is depicted is maybe the most realistic version of finding a fossil in the wild in this game that I've seen yet, but the setting for the fossil is a little bit wrong. This looks much more like something deep in the Appalachians where you just don't find fossil material. So here we see something that I think is much more realistic than some of the stuff we found before. The general geological setting of this area is sedimentary. It's got stratified rocks. They're kind of red color that we see a lot in sandstones. Sandstone is a really prime location for finding fossil material. The fossil here looks to me like it's supposed to represent a bear foot. It's way bigger than any bear's foot that I've ever seen. That's enormous. That's almost the size of Arthur. Generally 5 toes, they have claws at the ends. This looks like a bear foot. With that stated, again, this is a pretty realistic depiction of what finding a fossil might be like if it's eroding out of a cliff face. And often, we find fossils kind of in the middle of cliff faces like this. I've heard stories of people standing on folding chairs that are set up on top of rocks, just because they need to be able to reach the fossil. Often we need to remove a lot of the rock on top of the fossil, what we call the overburden, before we even get to the bone-bearing layer. Sometimes we spend entire summers out at our dig sites just removing overburden so that the next summer we can actually excavate the fossils that we found. It's a really, really time and energy-intensive task, but it's necessary. So again, this is something that is pretty reminiscent of things I've actually seen in the field before, and I think it's a pretty realistic depiction of a lot of how paleontology works. So Arthur found a really good one here. So here at this cliff face, we have another articulated leg with an ilium sticking up out of the ground. It looks like it's the exact same model that we saw earlier. Generally speaking, this looks not wrong for a dinosaur, but it doesn't look quite right either. I think just some of the detail is more based on mammals. That said, a very blade-like shape of the ilium that has kind of a semicircular profile is something we see a lot in theropod dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex and Velociraptor, two of the species that I study most intensively. This could be a dinosaur fossil. I would want to see more detail in the game to really make that identity pop, but it certainly looks like it could be.
Here, just as I thought. Totalosaurus West Elizabethus.
There is always a lot to talk about when we assemble dinosaurs. Skeletal mounts for museums are often riddled with inaccuracies and a lot of assumptions that go into making them that are not clearly explained to the viewer. It's kind of a pastime among paleontologists to walk with their colleagues through museum halls and point out every mistake that was made in putting the mount together. Often these mounts were made a long time ago when those mistakes were justifiable. Sometimes they were made more recently, and it was some sort of practical decision that the fossils had to be depicted in a way that's not quite accurate, and sometimes they're put together by people who don't really know the anatomy and don't try to learn it. It's always an interesting task to try to put fossils back together. It's more difficult than you might think.
That's quite a monster.
It should go without saying that this is not a real dinosaur. In fact, looking at this, none of the parts of its skeleton even look like dinosaur bones to me. Most of this looks mammalian. You can actually see a couple of scapulae that have these horizontal scapular spines on them, which is something I was talking about earlier. Some of the tail actually looks like it's supposed to come from a fish or a lizard, probably a large fish. The skull is a walrus skull with a bear skull on the back end with moose antlers. This is what we call in paleontology a chimera, a creature from Greek mythology that was part lion and part goat and part serpent. Chimera in the sciences just refers to any animal that is reconstructed from parts of different animals that were inaccurately put together. I think it's kind of fun that they included a paleontological chimera in this game, because in the age when Red Dead Redemption 2 takes place, dinosaurs were not really as much of a scientific interest as they were a public interest. Most paleontologists were actually interested in studying mammalian evolution and human evolution in particular. It's just that we kept finding these dinosaurs, and paleontologists knew that the public loved to go to museums to see dinosaurs, and so they would intentionally try to collect large, spectacular dinosaur specimens so that they could draw more visitors into the museums, get more donation money and money from entrance fees, and then they would be able to make more money for their own serious research on mammals. Now in the game, I don't know if the paleontologist that Arthur is working with is trying to be intentionally misleading with what she has here, or if she's just supposed to be a poorly trained crank scientist who really does think that this is a real app. In either case, I think it's really cool because the game is actually illustrating a particular era in paleontological history. People were just starting to explore the West. The West has tremendously plentiful dinosaur fossils and fossils of all different sorts of mammals. Scientists were beginning to get out there and start to scientifically catalog all the material they were finding, but there was this increasing problem of people using fossil material to try to turn a profit or make themselves wealthy. So I think it's a really nice little historical detail to put into the game here. It would have been very easy or maybe cliche to have a paleontologist from a major museum coming out collecting a real dinosaur. I think they've captured something here that not a lot of people know about, and that kind of attention to detail is one of the many reasons that I've been a huge fan of Red Dead Redemption 2 ever since it came out, and getting to do a video on it for you guys has been an absolute pleasure. If you want to see more of me, you can check out a YouTube channel that I run with some of my colleagues in the field of paleontology. We use video games to talk about scientific concepts. If you want to see more Gameology, you can find their other videos on Facebook and YouTube. We'll see you next time.